Hello, everyone. My name is Sachin Behere. I work as an experience design consultant for healthcare, and I'm currently based in Singapore, but I have spent a number of productive years previously in Eindhoven. So I'm very excited today to speak with somewhat familiar audience that we have today. This would have been, of course, a face-to-face dialogue on a normal day, but let's make the best out of it, the best out of the virtual medium that we have today. Thanks to Philips and thanks to the Dutch Design Week organizers. The subject of this presentation is how we could create a healing supportive environment for ICU patients. Sounds like quite a serious topic, but since this is a sharing session mainly for design audience, I thought I should first share the exciting results of this project and then take the opportunity to unfold my mental journey as a healthcare designer when I'm addressing design problems of this kind. So let me share with you the video first, and then we will talk. All right. So I hope you were able to get a glimpse of what this project was really all about. So let's begin by zooming into how our designer mind works when we are tackling such problems. For those who are design trained, you will recognize how you are constantly sensing the world around you and responding to it through the creative means. And each time we do that, we are learning something new, which makes us more and more free and puts us in a control of our thought process. In my experience, there is another step in between, which I call mind setting. It's all about setting the right frame of mind to look at the problem before responding to it. And this continuous cycle of these three steps, sensing, mind setting, and responding, it's what makes design a continuum of liberation, in my view. When you work as a designer in the healthcare field, you develop a special sensitivity for real life. It's possible that one day you and I will undergo a surgery or have a condition that requires intensive care. Now, ordinarily, we never think about this possibility, but yes, it's there. And the reality hits you in face when you see the hospital environment that looks like this and causes some kind of an emotional trauma inside you and definitely a negative stimulation. So when you're looking at problems like this, as a first natural step is to zoom into the details, sensing the problem as its most tangible level, looking at symptoms, looking at the context. So when you find that how common it is for the ICU patients to experience an acute state of confusion, which is called delirium, it can cause terrifying hallucinations. Patients can become aggressive, they can become really frightened. The constant lights and noise makes it very difficult for them to sleep. And that's one of the biggest risk factors for delirium. If you've had this condition and you were discharged, the doctors tell us that your chances of mortality in 6 months is 3 times higher, which means that it is going to seriously affect a long-term well-being of most patients who go into the ICU. So you can read clinical research, you hear stories about the patient experience all the time. There are papers written around it, but there's nothing more impactful and powerful than speaking with real patients and observing them directly, firsthand. The two wonderful people that I met during my field research in Australia while doing this project, they underwent some serious procedures. The 29-year-old Rebecca Craven and the 62-year-old Paul Manderson both had their heart transplant surgeries in this hospital. And both of them told us about their scary delusions that they experienced during their stay in ICU and how it has left a permanent emotional scar inside them. These are the patients who fought hard emotionally and physically to get out of their condition, to get out of the memory of an ICU, and now they are talking about improvements and innovations in the ICU space because they have felt it firsthand. And for designers like us, these are the people who are at the core of our inspiration. So what happens next? The next thing what you do is you bring together some people around you. When you bring this hard-hitting patient experience topic to the table in front of an extraordinary ICU doctor, a few sharp-minded researchers, design professionals, and technology people, you will be surprised that it generates an enormous amount of empathy. In Philips, we've talked a lot about radical empathy, but the power of coming together of different disciplines and having that umbrella, that belief that we need to change this situation for the patients for good, forever, in the best way we can, that's quite powerful. That's the root empathy that we have to constantly nurture and use. So if you're a designer in the driving seat of this project, you need to absolutely leverage this collective empathy and channelize it in such a way that your solution goes along the vision that you're already trying to create. But you cannot really diagnose a problem until you zoom out and until you look at the bigger picture. You really want to know how big the problem is. What's the magnitude? Is the problem worth solving? Like in the tandem skydiving, the picture that you see here, you also need to take your stakeholders along with you in this journey and show them the picture that you're trying to see as well at the same time. And this is when you start to formulate a frame of mind, which is the first step in what I call a mind setting. There you ask fundamental questions. How is an ICU set up? Why is it set up in the first place? For whom? Is it really for patients? Is it for the doctors? And then you start realizing that traditionally ICUs were designed for the clinicians, is for the efficiency of their operations and to make sure that the job that they're trying to do gets done. But it's not really keeping the patients in the focus or in the center. Part of being able to zoom out is also looking at the future. Now, being part of a world-class design community like what we have in Philips, we have access and imagination to gaze at the future. We are fully aware that future of healthcare is not limited to a hospital, but it's going to be distributed across the city and ultimately into our homes. It's actually already happening. At the same time, we know that ICU is the most expensive part of the hospital in terms of cost, and therefore its performance is always going to be under radar. This needs better attention. So as a patient, you want to be discharged as fast as possible and recover in the comfort of your home environment. At the same time, hospital wants to improve the performance of their ICU. So as a healthcare designer, once this large ecosystem sets into your mind, the problem suddenly becomes worth solving. Now, designers like me love to start from scratch. We love to create a new order. We want to ask some fundamental questions that no experts have asked because they are too familiar with the topic most of the times. And then you start looking for metaphors, which clarifies the current situation in a more graphic way. Is being an ICU like being like a car in a garage? Or is it like being a product that being assembled on an assembly line? What is the sensory experience like? If I'm a patient who wakes up in an ICU half conscious and in pain, what will matter to me the most? What will I truly care about? And then you start mapping your own mind right from scratch, and that starts to unfold many answers. And to me, starting from scratch might be inefficient, but it's very powerful because it really opens up new ideas and possibilities. Then you also start to sense that there are 7 dimensions through which you need to drive the patient's experience of the future. There is, of course, the 3-dimensional space, coming in from the architectural background. That's the most natural thing you want to think about first. But then there is an element of time because things change over time. People recover, their pain improves. Then there's people around you who are also a factor in the way you experience your care. There's technology, of course, is there either to make your life simpler or also there to make things more complex, depending on how you look at it. And finally, it's your own physical and mental health that's going to change and evolve over time. So all these dimensions are changing constantly, and we as designers, we have to be aware how they are evolving and changing all the time. Now, when we start the design process, it's quite tempting to just add new things. But what we have learned in healthcare is that we must remove first before adding. I've used this experience enhancement framework from Mentz and Wagener countless number of times. It looks extremely simple, but it's very powerful. What it tells us is to take away the unnecessary before adding new positive value bundles. You need to declutter before adding relevant concepts. If you only add or if you only remove from a current state, you're never going to reach that positive and the productive future state. So an ICU that is full of visual complexity and intensity, it needs to be neutralized first by decluttering, by removing things that are not necessary anymore because they have been there because of legacy or because of older technology, or sometimes it's just the way they are and nobody has questioned them. And you come in through a fresh pair of eyes and you say, hey, what is it doing here? Can it not be somewhere else? Can this piece of technology not be shared? Can there be a place for family members? So you start to question, and through that questioning, you start to remove the unnecessary before creating the fresh ground for you to play on. Now, we are all trained to think out of the box. And this may sound really counterintuitive, but many times we ignore what the box looks like before we step out of it because it's taken for granted. So it's important that we do some fundamental incremental innovation first and get it out of the way so that it becomes your fallback option, just in case your blue sky vision doesn't materialize in the end. So this is an example of one of the first explorations, reimagining a single room ICU solution to make it more like a hybrid of a hospital room and a personal bedroom. So rethinking the type of furniture that is less institutional, trying to mentally rotate the bed and see if the atmosphere in the room can change simply by changing the orientation of the patient from facing the nurse's side to the window side, which is going to give them more daylight, more connection to the outside. So while we are getting this idea out of the way, I'm still not convinced that why should the new solution be still built around old constraints? And I really want to move away from an ICU design that just happens to be. Um, and it happens to be because of a few bunch of life-saving devices that are necessary, but they're also visually chaotic. So I rather express the ICU as something intentional and not accidental, and craft it as a symbol of nurturing. That's what patient is expecting, and that's what the patient will benefit from the most. So you start thinking, how can I bring daylight into this space, which is a natural cure? It's a natural way to create positiveness in an environment which is that intensive. How do I create enclosures but not walls? I want the patients to feel connected to the outside world and not feel locked up inside. I want to build a prospect of recovery and a ray of hope. And that's all of those things you need to do in that confined space. Then you start to lift those constraints one by one. You free up your mind. I started to imagine that it's a smart enclosure that I need to build within a large architectural space. So I was looking at something dynamic, something changeable, not permanent and fixed. So I started removing the clutter, but I didn't quite know whether this needs to be an interior architecture solution or it needs to be like a furniture solution, or perhaps it's something in between. That wasn't quite getting clear in the beginning. So when an idea like this starts to germinate, you want to visualize whether this idea can scale up well as well. What will happen when multiple such enclosures come together? Not one ICU bed, but how will the entire ICU department starts to function and look like? So you start beginning to search for a rhythm, a pattern that gives you the most flexibility, whether it's a square grid or a network of honeycomb hexagons, or it's a circle, but you're starting to look at a principle of growth. And then you start to mentally play with that idea. You start to imagine different scenarios of use because you've heard so much from the researchers and the patients directly and from the nursing staff. What are the different clinical scenarios where patients are going to be in the space and they're going to face different level of difficulties? And then you're looking at a physical geometry that supports the key concept, and it also supports different scenarios in a most effective way. So in this case, a natural circular shape made of modular components came to my rescue because it suddenly opened up possibilities to rotate the ICU in any direction I want. If the patient needs visual monitoring, we can face the patient towards the staff areas. If the patient is going to benefit from daylight, we may rotate the entire assembly towards the window and completely change the patient's experience as they start to get better and better. Now, the design process at this exploration phase, as you can all imagine, is very mentally taxing. You can get really you can get tired. So you're looking for a breakthrough, but at the same time, your brain needs also a break. And if the bigger picture starts to wear you out, just roll off your sleeves and jump into small details. And it's what I call a designer's weekend. And you start jumping into the millimeters of the problem area. And I guarantee you, you will come out all sweaty, but very happy, which is subconsciously leading you to that ultimate new zone that you want to be in. And all this while, when you're struggling to see whether it's an architectural solution or industrial design solution, guess what? You discover it's going to be a hybrid solution, quite unconventional, but it's something new. And it is best suited as a spatial product instead of being something built ground up, like what you do in architecture and interior design. But it is going to be something suspended down from the ceiling, keeping the floor absolutely free. So you can imagine that this is going to be a product that looks like space, but actually it's suspended from the ceiling and it's going to be invisible if you turn it off. It's going to go in the background. It's going to be absent when you don't need it. That's the ultimate dream, to create technology that is hidden, it's ambient, it's not there, but it gets activated when you need it the most. And then the aha moment comes, because You've got your basics right, and then you start to put the humans back into the picture. You start looking at whether the idea that you have created starts to radiate the care in its pure sense. You also start to give it the name. The concept now starts to get a name called Critical Care Experience Suite. And this starts to show the potential for an adaptive and smart environment for the future. The suite is made of privacy panels that can give you the full enclosure, or you collapse them and make them disappear out of the patient's view, as I mentioned before. You may let the skylight look like a bright sunny day, or program it to act as a circadian lighting that helps regulate your sleep. And sleep is a big topic because lack of good sleep is at the root cause of delirium in most cases. You want to introduce clinical screens on the outside for the doctors and the nurses to keep an eye on the patient's data feeds without them having to step into this patient's zone all the time and disturb their sleep. So you want to create a smart monitoring system that mirrors what's happening close to the patient's body, but something that is visible from a long distance, and something that is also smart enough that will activate their feeds depending on which context it is. So if a doctor walks in, you show a different kind of information. If the family walks close by, the system automatically feeds different kind of information to the users. And for the inside of this space, the patient doesn't need to see all those clinical data all the time. So you can look at a screen which is essentially displaying healing supportive audiovisual for the benefit of the patient to give them some level of positive distraction and also to help them to stay connected with the outside world while they are in the ICU. So as you can imagine, it's one unified concept that has included many small, innovative, and novel components. And we started to hypothesize that this kind of a programmed environment can potentially be prescribed to the patient, just like getting a prescribed medication. So if I'm a doctor and if I sense that a particular patient will benefit from a very low stimulus environment, the patient has been just out of the surgery, you don't want to disturb their sleep, so why not prescribe a space which can actually give them that protection? It can be very low on lighting, it can have limited accessibility for visitors, it can have noiseless alarming. All those features can be activated based on the prescribed environment. But as the patient starts to get better and better and starts their recovery, the doctors will also want them to start sensing their environment and feel and connect and be part of the surrounding more and more and gain their autonomy back. So you can imagine that down the road, close to discharge, the doctors can say, hey, now the patient is much better, he's stable or she's stable, and ideally they should start seeing more visitors and family so that they start to get a sense of normalcy, a sense of family environment, where they can really start to feel independent and they start to feel connected and get ready for discharge. That is not happening in the ICUs right now. At the moment you're ready for discharge, you are discharged into another unit, and that's a step down unit, and it's another clinical space where you have sort of graduated into. But for the autonomy and for that social connect that patients will benefit enormously from, there is no such system available. So end of the day, you want to create a design that facilitates all these things, but it's also the design that needs to be in the background. It's like an instrument to support recovery. It's helping you achieve a balance between technical functionality, human dignity, as well as well-being. So end of the day, you want the patients to go home and remember the happy side of the ICU, not the scary and the dreadful side of the ICU for the long term. And as a designer, that's the best thing you can hope for, a positive memory that lasts long and that converts into a positive impression of healthcare in general, which is also good for the hospital's brand because the same patients are going to recommend the hospital to their friends and family. So to sum up, I want to say that the project was first launched in Australia through an event because we did this as a collaborative work with a leading hospital in Australia. And the purpose at that time was to raise awareness around innovation in critical care. Eventually, the project also went on winning a few international design awards. which sort of is reassuring for us that the design that is rooted in empathy can truly have a universal value and appeal. And that's a very valuable thing for healthcare designers. So looking back, my journey in this project has been like a journey of self-discovery, and in that process, also contributing to the liberation of healthcare from being conventional to a forward-thinking, forward-looking, and a futuristic direction, which is a great takeaway for me. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed the content. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Sachin, for sharing this amazing and very personal design story with us. It's quite clear that this project started from the mindset that patients and staff are people first, which I really, really like. And I think it's a perfect example of what we call radical empathy. You already said it. Just great to see how you managed to bring the human experience back into the ICU. My name is Colette Forma. I'm the moderator of today's Q&A session with Sachin. We already have a few questions coming in, Sachin. So to the audience, if you have more questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A panel, and we'll try and answer as many of them as possible within our time slot. To start off, there is a question, Sachin, around from a hospital planning perspective. Designing a circular ICU shell has a high space requirement and creates in-between spaces that might not be used directly to support the patient. So how much space, that's the question, this solution requires compared to a more square shape? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because that's the first question I always get asked by many of the audiences of this project. So let me explain the background of this thing. I think the shape is not important. The idea is to facilitate the rotation of the patient bed. And if you are able to do that within any shape of a room, you're still achieving your objectives. The circular shape is iconic in a way that it creates the feeling of a safe enclosure. So it's an expression of a space that gives you that feeling. Now, coming to the practicality of such a shape, you can imagine, or you can think that maybe there's a negative space lying around that cannot be actively used. Well, if you really think through the amount of things that an existing ICU or conventional ICU has, I would say at least 20% of those are there just for historic reasons and not for day-to-day practical use. So the first thing you're going to do is declutter. You're going to remove it, but not entirely remove it. So you're going to create a parking space nearby such that when it's needed, you can pull those technologies and those trolleys and those supply carts forward as they're needed. So just by decluttering, you're going to preempt the need for corner spaces. Now, even if you then need those spaces, they can be used. For example, if I go back to a slide before, if you look at this slide, actually the corner space merges into the family zone, which is at the backside of the ICU. So what was a round enclosure, when it is not an enclosure, actually it's a free open space. And that blending of two zones, whether it's a core clinical zone that's part of this circle, starts to blend with the family zone, which is more close to the window and it's a little more informal. These spaces easily blend into each other. So that's one way to sort of to bring back the dynamic nature of this space, and that's about it. The other way to address this is also to say the storage that is traditionally used next to the ICU beds, it's on wheels, it's mobile, it's movable, but is anyone moving it? Very rarely, because only the people who will refill and replenish the supplies, they will come in and redo it. But some of those carts and devices never leave their space. In an environment that you are protecting a clutter-free space around the patient, the peripheral space is where those mobile equipment can be parked. Now, in case of COVID, and when you have more alertness around hygiene, you don't want to share too many things between multiple patients. But still, if you're thinking about mobile nurse stations, if you're looking at computers on wheels, these are the things. The mobile device, mobile carts and appliances can easily be shared, and they can be parked and used by those so-called not used spaces. So that's in a nutshell the answer. Yes, the circular shape is not traditionally efficient, but it's a trade-off between creating a cozy environment and a clutter-free and a dynamic space that actually can overlap with social areas and family zones as well. I hope that answers the question.
I'm sure it does. Thanks for clarifying, Sachin. Another question. You've told us that patients don't always sleep or rest well because of the noise around them in the ICU. How does this solution tackles that specific problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I think noise is always underestimated, but we have to realize there are two sources of noise. One is equipment, where the equipment is constantly making beeps and signals. Now, there's a large body of work within Philips and within other technology companies also looking at creating noiseless alarming, which means if most of the noises are not useful or they are not giving the pattern that nurses are wanting to hear, they are sort of redundant. So is there an intelligent way to reduce that noise? And actually, that's possible. So there are artificial intelligence that can drive noiseless alarming, and that's already underway. But the other source of noise is people. And how do you stop nurses and clinicians and other people in the ICU from talking? And that's a behavioral issue. And a lot of times, a number of hospitals have tried to compensate for that by introducing some behavioral change ideas, like change management through building awareness that, yes, this is a sleeping time for ICU patient. So please keep quiet, or please lower your volume when you're talking about the weekend and you're talking about sports while you're delivering care, which is perfectly normal as well. But in fact, within Philips, there has been a research that says the people's noise is even a bigger factor than sometimes the technology noise. So you need to work on both ends. It's the matter of how much behavior change can contribute and how much technology can help. You could also put big signs and say, don't talk, but that doesn't always work. Or you could introduce cues through technology, and you can create a carrot and a stick method where you can introduce incentives for people to behave in a certain way and keep the noises low. So there are multiple directions to address this problem.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. So, Sachin, during your research, did you come across any social and cultural aspects that could help define the ambience that a patient would expect in that specific geography?
I won't limit it to the geography, but it's more like a mindset and the culture that you're coming from, which requires, which is about two things. One is privacy is one aspect. You know, as a ICU patient, you are entirely vulnerable. You're in the hands of the clinicians all the time. You have very little control on where you are, what you do. So having that mindset of letting that control go, letting that privacy go, is a cultural element. Not everyone will have comfort level with that. So some cultures and some people may prefer a lot of privacy. Some people might be actually find comfort in having a better overview with nursing staff because they feel more reassured. They're always being watched for. In Australian market, in the public setting that we have looked at, it's more of that open setting where it's more reassuring. Having constantly being eyeballed by doctors and nurses is reassuring to the patients all the time. But if you go to American market or other markets that value privacy and they value family space and the single patient room concept, you might find that that's the preference. There's the cultural preference. But then there you also have to worry about not having the line of sight with the staff or not having that social environment around you that also is sometimes reassuring. So there are pros and cons to different cultural setups, cultural preferences, and how the architectural space sort of responds to those cultures. Yeah.
Clear. Thanks for that. Do you have any idea why ICU ignored the design aspect for such a long time, basically?
Yes, I mean, there are multiple attempts being done. I mean, ICU design, it's not the first time we are doing it. There are lots of design groups and hospitals who are constantly trying to innovate in the ICU space. But you can imagine the priority of a ICU is to keep people alive. And we cannot deny that. That has to be the priority. Keeping people alive and bringing to the level of stability is always going to be the first focus. Everything else comes second. So traditionally, it has always been that you get people to a certain level of stability and move them out to a step down unit where better or different kind of care will kick in. But now we are thinking about a long-term impact of ICU stay. It's not only about, so to speak, fixing the patient and getting them moving and you're treating the next patient. It's one of the key KPIs is also to look at long-term impact of the ICU stay. And the research shows that the long-term impact can actually have patients return to the hospital, or as we heard before, the mortality rates can go up. So there is value in starting to look at a holistic well-being of a patient, not just to keep them alive. So far, the focus has been clinical, but more and more the hospitals are realizing that it has to take into account clinical as well as the well-being aspects for the patient. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's really smart to use that environment as an instrument, literally, like you said, to support healing and recovery. So really interesting. There is a question, Sachin, around is there any specific healthcare design methodology or process that you use or recommend?
Yes, very much. I think I recommend a combination of two processes. The first process is called evidence-based design, which basically means two things. One is to search for the best possible evidence where you can create your hypothesis from, to say, this is the best knowledge that's available in the realm of clinical and design together. And there's a whole body of research that is validated, that is globally recognized, that tells you what are the standards and what are the learnings. And those learnings could be episodic or they could be collected over a number of years of studies, which will give you certain baselines to look at and certain boundary conditions that you can look at. And the second type of evidence-based design is to hypothesize, meaning that if it's a concept that nobody has done before, then you are the first one to try it. So you start with a hypothesis and say, if I do this, it's going to lead me to that. If I do X, it's going to give me an outcome of Y. And if you are lucky, if you have that in your program, you can go back and after implementation, you can actually measure the impact in the best possible way. So evidence-based design is essentially a driving process for these kind of projects. The other is what we call co-create, which is essentially a design thinking methodology or even a design thinking mindset that is pioneered by Philips in the healthcare space. And that pays a lot more attention to the user. So user becomes your starting point. User is your end point, because why you're designing, you're not designing it for yourself to satisfy your creative urges. You're actually designing something for the benefit of the patients and the staff who are actual benefactories of your design. So the user-centric approach that starts the design thinking process that also involves multidisciplinary approach. Designer cannot do this in isolation. You have to interact with clinicians, you have to take technology inputs into account, you have to look at very unconventional inputs as well. I mean, one of the engineers on this project came from airline industry, and he was telling us how you create mobile dynamic spaces in a very confined space, like in an airplane. And then you start to borrow inspiration from other vernaculars and other industries to bring innovation into healthcare. So broadly, those are the two methodologies I would suggest looking into.
Really nice. Thank you very much. In the whole trajectory, you must have also had responses from stakeholders, doctors, nurses. Can you elaborate on that? Can you share some of the insights you found there or responses you got?
Yeah, definitely. I will start with doctors. I think it's interesting because we might think doctors are the one who deliver care in these environments. It's only partially true. Doctors are there to make the big decisions for the patient, and they're doing the most complex analysis on the data. But it's the 24/7 environment, and then it's the nurses who are going to actually implement those actions, and they're going to keep an eye. And you see different priorities or different feedbacks. The doctors will rely a lot on their intuition, and they will rely a lot on their gut feeling as compared to the data that is being shown to them. And therefore, their outlook on such solutions is more about, okay, how does it help me reinforce my intuitive way of working? If it does, that's fantastic, and I will use this as a tool to advance my care practice. For the nurses, it's more about the convenience. It's about practicalities. It's about how am I going to do this by myself, and what are the steps you are saving me in my daily work through this solution. So for them, it's more about, are you saving me time? Are you saving me effort? Are you saving me physical burden? Are you saving me mental burden? And therefore, different aspects of the solution appeal to different user groups. And what we've heard, the best compliment I've heard from is from the patients, because they have been through this. They have seen the worst experience that ICU can give you and the scary part of it. And when we invited patients to evaluate this concept, they were completely blown away. They said, we could never imagine that a space to recover can feel like this, or actually a space to recover really thinks about me. It takes care of me. And that's a simple thing to hear, but it's very powerful. So those are the three different perspectives I've heard from in this project.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. Sachin, two questions around the clutter and an overview of that. So one of them is there a more granular overview of what the detractors of the patient experience are? Example, cables, materials, spaces, etc. I think you showed a little bit in your presentation already. Another question is, the decluttering sounds intimidating and overwhelming, especially for an ICU system that has been used for so long. Is the whole team involved in this part of the project? And if so, what helped to keep all of you focused here, especially given that there are so many disciplines involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the decluttering is a topic that is more cultural than clinical. Yes, there is a clinical requirement because you need those machines just in case, and actually the machines are performing what they're supposed to perform. But are they orchestrated? Are they organized in a way that they don't create clutter? Now, whose problem is the clutter? It's a visual problem for the patients if the clutter is indeed in their view, but it's also a visual and aesthetic problem for the family members. Because imagine if you're walking into this environment and trying to be part of that environment, sit next to the patient, try to do some care activity. You can be quite intimidated because you don't want to touch anything by accident. You don't want to trip over a cable and pull a plug that you don't want to pull. So as a family member who wants to participate in care, the clutter is coming in the way. It's discouraging you from being part of the care process. Now, is it required? Maybe not, but from the well-being perspective and from cooperation perspective, the role of family also becomes very important, and clutter comes in the way. If you look at the clinician side or the nurse's side, the clutter can actually be hazardous. It can actually become a safety risk. And therefore, just like when I talked about noiseless alarming as a direction, there's also a direction around clutterless ICU, which means how can we create less cables? Can we transmit more and more data in a cableless way? In this project, we try to declutter by creating an encasement. So we are not replacing technology right away. Maybe in the future, maybe in 5 years, 10 years time frame, when a lot of things will shrink in size and they will be transmitting data wirelessly, things will become automatically less cluttered. But as a roadmap to that end, what we are going to do is we are going to encase the visual clutter so it looks less messy and more organized. So as a first step, you're going to address the visual part of the clutter. As a second step, you're going to address the physical ergonomic part of the clutter. Yeah.
Thank you. What impact does the pandemic, as we know, has on a design concept like this? I would imagine that maybe things change.
Yeah, indeed. So this concept was conceived pre-COVID-19 and in the context of large open bay ICU practice that is common in Australia, which has their own benefits, as I mentioned before. But because of COVID, the concept of isolation has gained a lot of importance. In fact, most elements of critical care experience suite are still relevant. Example, the circadian lighting, the noiseless monitoring, the dynamic audiovisual content feed, and the whole idea of dosing the stimulus levels in an environment, they still hold valid and they deliver the benefits. The form language may need to change because we can't possibly have a completely open ICU given the hygiene and the cross-contamination issues around. So the idea is to adopt this concept in the future such that we retain the core benefits, but the form language is, or the enclosure can be more suited to the requirements of hygiene and the airflow. Yeah.
Thank you. As a closing question, because I think we answered all of them, what is the next step for this amazing concept?
Yeah, it's interesting because normally these concepts are created in the realm of R&D, where you are actually trying to have a innovation roadmap, and the project is part of the roadmap. Now, in this project, it is a project that germinated in the marketplace for Philips. So it's a bottom-up, market-driven innovation, as we call it. And what it means is that instead of investing in-house, inside out, we are trying to create a vision that already resonates in the market, resonates with the hospitals in the future. And then we bring it inside and say, this is a concept. Now, shall we build a proof of concept? Shall we build a prototype and then bring it to the next level? So ideally, that will be the pathway to bring it to the level of a prototype. Perhaps it's a prototype of sub-concepts, so it doesn't have to be everything all together, but maybe the most interesting concepts such as circadian lighting, something that can give you instant results in terms of delirium reduction and outcomes that our hospitals are interested in. So that would be the next step, to find those relevant topics or subtopics in the concept and then prototyping them in the context of the market.
That's really, really exciting. So looking forward to seeing those next steps. Sachin, can you press the next slide? Because I can imagine that maybe people attending this inspirational and visionary talk would be inspired to maybe explore career opportunities to become your colleague or one of your colleagues. So if that's the case, just scan the QR code and sign up for the talent pool. You'll be informed by all the roles we have at Philips Experience Design. That brings us to the end of this session. I would like to thank you, Sachin, for sharing your personal story, which I really, really loved. And I'm looking forward to seeing this critical care experience suite come alive. So thank you very much. And also thanks for all the listeners and attendees and, making sure this was an engaging session. We have still some sessions left this week. So if you're interested, just sign up and join us. We'll be back. For now, this was it. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colette, and bye-bye, everybody.